Imagine an empire so incredibly powerful that it literally dwarfed contemporary Europe, and yet it was carrying the seeds of its own spectacular destruction right from the very beginning. Today, in this explainer, we're diving into the Mughal Dynasty of South Asia, a dynasty that compressed staggering ambition, unbelievable artistry, and total dissolution into a surprisingly short historical window. Now, to really wrap our heads around their fall, we first have to grasp their staggering scale. At its economic peak under Shah Jahan, the Mughal Empire didn't just dominate South Asia, it generated roughly a quarter of the entire world's manufacturing output. Think about that for a second. Alongside Qing China, it was the industrial powerhouse of the pre-industrial world, easily eclipsing the combined GDP of contemporary Europe. Their cotton textiles, silks, and indigo were the lifeblood of a massive global trade network. So that leads us to a pretty profound mystery. By the early 18th century, the Mughals had reached their absolute maximum territorial size. But then, within just 50 years of Emperor Aurangzeb's death in 1707, this unstoppable superpower had completely disintegrated into a patchwork of fragmented states. We're going to explore this central mystery today, mapping out this ultimate Icarus arc to understand exactly how an engine of such immense wealth and power basically broke down under its own weight. All right, let's start with Section 1, the rise to power, and see how they built this engine of empire. This dynasty literally exploded onto the scene in India in 1526. Zahir ad-Din Muhammad Babur, a Central Asian prince, clinched the Battle of Panipat through a truly brilliant use of Ottoman-style field artillery and wagon fort tactics. But Babur's conquest was pretty fragile. In fact, his son Humayun actually lost the empire and spent 15 long years in exile before finally clawing it back. It was actually Babur's grandson, Akbar the Great, taking the throne at just 13 years old, who acted as the master architect here. He took what was essentially a volatile startup and completely transformed it into a highly durable corporate monopoly. Akbar's absolute genius was building what's known as the mansabdari system. He needed to replace fractured tribal and regional loyalties with a centralized meritocratic machine. So, whether you were Turkic, Persian, Afghan, or a Hindu Rajput, you were assigned a mansab, a numerical rank. This brilliantly fused a really diverse set of elites into a single service nobility. Suddenly, your loyalty was no longer to your local warlord. It was tied directly to the imperial throne. But, to fund a massive administration like that, you need serious cash flow. So Akbar's finance minister, Raja Todur Mal, designed the zapt system. It assessed land revenue based on a 10-year average of crop yields and, crucially, demanded payment in a stable silver currency, the rupee. This incredibly sophisticated system kept the empire heavily funded, highly monetized, and fully capable of sustaining an immense military force without having to constantly renegotiate taxes. Moving right along into Section 2, Zenith and Hidden Cracks, the Icarus Flight. As we move into the 17th century under Akbar's successors, Jahangir and Shah Jahan, we see this era of unparalleled architectural brilliance, but it secretly masked a growing rot. Under Shah Jahan, Mughal wealth became absolutely legendary. He built the Taj Mahal, the Red Fort, and the fabled Peacock Throne. But these monuments came at a staggering financial cost. That immense expenditure, combined with a nobility that just kept expanding, put massive strain on the treasury. And because the Mughals never established a formal rule of succession, transitions were always settled by the sword. Before Shah Jahan even died, a vicious fratricidal war broke out among his sons. The ultimate victor, Aurangzeb, executed his brothers and threw his own father in prison. Shah Jahan actually lived his final 8 years as a captive in the Agra fort, with nothing but a window view of the Taj Mahal he had built. Underneath all this glitter, a Jagadari crisis began to brew. Think of it kind of like a massive administrative pyramid scheme. The emperor paid his nobles by giving them temporary rights to collect land revenue, which were called jagirs. But pretty soon, there were simply more nobles than there was assignable land. So what did the nobles do? To squeeze out as much wealth as possible before being reassigned, they ruthlessly overtaxed the peasantry. The empire's administrative engine was basically overheating, creating a brutal cycle of extraction that eventually drove desperate, starving peasants to armed rebellion. Which brings us to Section 3, overextension under Aurangzeb, and the ultimate breaking point. Aurangzeb is a fascinating figure because he achieved the ultimate paradox. He pushed the empire's borders to their absolute maximum, stretching deep into the southern tip of India, but he did it at a catastrophic cost. He fought these endless, unwinnable guerrilla wars against the Marathas in the Decca. We're talking about moving his entire court, a mobile city of literally 500,000 people, south for over 20 years. This completely exhausted the military and drained the treasury dry. On top of that, his selective return to orthodox religious policies and his habit of intervening in successions totally alienated the crucial Rajput allies that Akbar had so carefully cultivated. All the while, that crushing overtaxation we talked about ignited massive agrarian revolts among the Jats, Satnamis, and Sikhs up in the north. Let's look at the fallout in Section 4, the 18th century crisis, defined by fragmentation and utter chaos. Just to put this chaos into perspective, in the 12 years immediately following Aurangzeb's death in 1707, an unbelievable 9 emperors occupied the throne. The once rock-solid centralized power structure totally collapsed into bloody factional warfare. Powerful noble groups, like the famous Sayyid brothers, essentially became kingmakers, installing and murdering emperors whenever it suited them. The center was just falling apart. Because of this, the once mighty center was completely hollowed out. Provincial governors in wealthy places like Hyderabad, Awadh, and Bengal saw the chaos in Delhi, stopped sending their revenue, and effectively became independent states. And then came the external blows. In 1739, the Persian conqueror Nadir Shah sacked Delhi, massacring its citizens and carting off the priceless peacock throne. The Afghan ruler Ahmad Shah Abdali followed that up with repeated invasions. Meanwhile, the Marathas were surging northward, collecting tribute across the land. The Mughal emperor was left as a mere figurehead, trapped in his own capital. This sets the stage perfectly for Section 5, the British takeover in the twilight of sovereignty. As the empire splintered, the British East India Company made a very calculated move from commerce to conquest, and they used a highly specific legal mechanism to do it. After defeating the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II at the Battle of Buxar, they forced him to sign the Treaty of Allahabad. This granted the British the Diwani, the legal right to collect all revenue in the incredibly wealthy province of Bengal. The absolute genius and the tragedy of this move was that the British maintained the convenient fiction of Mughal sovereignty. They pretended to just be the emperor's humble revenue agents while permanently stripping away all his actual financial control. There was this poignant contemporary phrase that perfectly captures the tragic reality of Emperor Shah Alam II at this time. He was eventually blinded by a rogue chief and reduced to nothing more than a British pensioner. People darkly joked that the Emperor of the World now ruled an empire stretching only from Delhi to Palam, which was just a nearby suburban town. It would be like a modern head of state having their jurisdiction reduced to the powers of a local suburban mayor. His authority barely extended past the physical walls of the Red Fort. So, stepping back, we have to ask in Section 6, why did it fall? Let's do the autopsy. Modern historians essentially perform an autopsy on this collapse through 3 main lenses, and it's important we look at them neutrally to understand the whole picture. The older imperial nationalist school focuses heavily on individual failures, pointing the finger specifically at Aurangzeb's religious orthodoxy and his stubborn military overreach. Then you have the Aligarh school, which argues that it didn't really matter who was sitting on the throne. For them, the failure was purely systemic, driven by that Jagardari land crisis and the crushing taxation on peasants. Finally, the revisionist school challenges the word decline entirely. They argue the empire didn't just collapse into some dark age. Rather, its highly effective administrative DNA simply decentralized into vigorous, economically dynamic regional successor states. As is so often the case in history, the truth is likely a messy composite of all 3: deep structural strain, contingent political choices, and regional transformation. Finally, we arrive at Section 7, 1857, the final act. This is the tragic epilogue. During the massive Indian Rebellion of 1857, mutinying sepoys of the Bengal army marched into Delhi and reluctantly crowned the 82-year-old figurehead Bahadur Shah II as the Emperor of Hindustan. Now, he didn't plan this uprising, but he became its symbolic head. And when the British eventually recaptured Delhi, their reprisals were absolutely brutal. The emperor's sons were executed, Bahadur Shah II himself was tried for treason, which was a legally dubious charge anyway since he wasn't technically a British subject, and he was exiled. The mighty dynasty founded by Babur centuries earlier ended in a colonial court-martial, and the final emperor died in an unmarked grave in Rangoon, kept deliberately hidden to prevent it from ever becoming a site of nationalist veneration. But here's the thing. Even as their political power vanished into thin air, their legacy proved incredibly durable. If you look at the administrative systems in India and Pakistan today, Mughal vocabulary like zamindar, tehsil, and diwan is still deeply embedded in how things work. Their syncretic Indo-Persian culture sparked the total flourishing of the Urdu language. And of course, their monumental architecture, from the Taj Mahal to the Red Fort, continues to define the visual identity of the entire subcontinent to this day. The cultural infrastructure they built vastly outlasted their political dynasty. And this whole story leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought. The Mughal Empire is a total masterclass in the paradox of success. The very things that built them up, a centralized military nobility funded by aggressive agrarian taxation, became the exact same mechanisms that tore them apart once they reached the limits of their expansion. They simply couldn't balance the ledger forever. So it forces us to ask, can any system, even today, indefinitely sustain its own growth without eventually overheating the very engine that powers it?